Hey, and welcome to my first and maybe last tutorial I ever do. A while back I started making these 3D lenticular prints, and I've gotten a lot of questions on how these are made and if I could do a tutorial on this project. So as a starter project, I'm gonna show you how to make this. There's gonna be quite a bit to cover, and fair warning, this is not an easy project. You do need a lot of tools. It's pretty expensive, and it can require some fine tuning based off of your personal setup. But I'm just gonna keep this video pretty basic and just walk you through my process from start to finish. Also want to add a major disclaimer that I'm not an expert at making these. I'm just a guy on the internet who figured out one way to do this. I will link to some of the best YouTube videos and resources that I've found from people who are way more experienced in this subject if you want to dive deeper. So let's get started. Now, all of this will be listed in the description in the order that I talk about them, but let's start over here with the printer. This is a pretty basic Epson inkjet printer, which I use to print at 720 DPI. The DPI is very important in this project, so you can use other printers, but I'm only going to be talking about the process with this specific printer. Later in the tutorial, I'll talk about how the printer affects some of the later stages. Once you start to understand some of the principles of making lenticular prints, it's easy to swap out some of these variables later on. I also have an 8.5 by 11 glossy premium paper where I will be printing my final image. You probably don't need this large of a print, but there are some benefits to using a larger piece of paper, which I'll touch on a little later. And we also have the very important lens. You'll need a 50 LPI lens with adhesive. I chose this lens for this project because it's fairly easy to work with and get online, and the adhesive is already on there, so you don't have to worry about figuring out that step. Also have some various tools for attaching that lens to the image. So we have some masking tape. Other tape might work, but this is what I've been using. A cloth for wiping off the lens. Anything that gets caught between the lens and the print will create a bubble that you won't be able to get out. I've got a box cutter, a laminator that has a cold setting. You can probably get away without this and put these together manually. I haven't tried that. I also have a squeegee thing, not 100% necessary, but it helps remove tiny bubbles after it goes through the laminator. Something to trim your laminated print. It doesn't have to be this, just know that the lens and the print together are pretty thick, so it has to be pretty sharp and robust. And I also have this corner tool if you want to add rounded edges, but definitely not needed if you want to skip this one. Finally, we have a few virtual supplies. There's the series of pictures that all get interlaced together into the finished lenticular print. You can use any images for this, but since we're trying to create this, I'm providing you with the files necessary to do that. The files will all be available for free on gumroad.com, so you can download and use them for this tutorial. You'll also need the software for interlacing those images, which I'm going to be using 3D Master Kit. There are some other alternatives, but I've had limited success and nothing I felt comfortable putting into a tutorial for a wider audience. This software will allow us to take these frames, interlace them together to give us this funny looking image, which we can then print out and combine with this lens, and that will give us our finished lenticular print. And trust me, I wish I could just give you this interlaced image that the software makes so that you could just skip a bunch of these steps, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. All of these lenses are unique, so my lens will most likely have slightly different optics than yours. That means you have to do your own calibrations in order to get an image that's specific to your lens. Otherwise, it won't really work. Anyway, that's everything you need. Besides a computer as well, which I know is a lot. But let's move on to it will make or break your entire print, so we need to get this step right. You just have to follow these instructions. So in 3D Master Kit, we'll select Project and then select Pitch Test. We'll need to know our starting pitch. This is a 50 LPI lens, so we should start there. And with the test step, I'm going to start with 0.2. We'll be changing this number to slowly refine the pitch test, but it's basically both subtracting and adding this number to the pitch to figure out what is that true LPI. You'll need to put in your printer resolution. Again, mine is 720. And then there's some other settings which you can play around with, but this is what I typically use. And then you can hit generate. Now we have this image and we need to print it out. This part might be a little tricky because unless you have the exact same computer printer setup as me, some of these things might look a little different for you, but I will walk you through what we're trying to do here. So I'm gonna hit this print preview button, and then on this screen, I'm gonna hit print setup. First, I'll just make sure that my printer is selected, and I'm gonna go over here to properties. Again, this will probably look different for you, but what we're trying to do here is tell the printer what kind of paper we're using and that we want to print in the highest quality possible. Also, whatever settings we use here, we wanna make sure we use those same settings in our final print. So I'm just gonna double check that I've got the right paper size. I don't want borderless. I'm printing in a portrait orientation, the right paper, highest quality. I'm not gonna touch any of these other settings. In my more options, I'm also gonna make sure high speed is unchecked. You might have that option. Again, I'm just optimizing for quality. Sometimes there's some other things you can do in your printer settings, like making sure your print head is clean or doing an alignment test. I've also heard it's best to make sure your print head is only printing in one direction rather than printing on both passes. So just little optimizations here and there for quality. After all of that, we are going to hit print. Okay, so now that we have this, we can finally start to do something. If you put your pitch test down, you should start to see something pretty interesting start to happen. If you don't, make sure that you're not putting the lens down in the wrong orientation or the lens isn't upside down. The flat side should be facing down. I also like to align this in this orientation on its side because your eyes are in line with the lenticular lines. If you tried to align it this way, technically each eye is seeing a slightly different angle, so it makes it a little harder to see what's going on. So obviously this lens is a little smaller than this page, but that's fine. So first I'm going to make sure that one edge has like a nice solid black line that's lined up on the side. We should start to see this circular pattern, and you'll notice there's kind of a point where they meet right here in the center. Now the pattern is fun and all, but what we're really looking for is a singular bar that has a really nice solid color. But we want the color to shift really evenly between black and white. So right now, 49.8 and 49.6 are the most uniform, but you can see there's still a little bit of a gradient to them. They're not all black or all white. So we're gonna go back into 3D Master Kit and print out another one of these to hopefully get a little bit closer to our final result. So what I did was I changed the test step to 0.01 instead of 0.2. So quite a big jump. You don't have to jump that far necessarily. You can do smaller steps. But now when we align this, you'll see that there's a much more uniform color shift. It's maybe not the easiest to see on camera because I jumped all the way from 0.2 to 0.01, but I think I'm gonna move forward with 49.72 as my final number because it seems to shift the best and has a pretty uniform color all the way across. Plus, I tested this earlier. I kind of alluded to this before, but just remember that this test is specific to this lens. You want to set this lens aside and know that it's the one you're going to be using for your final print. Sometimes you might get multiple lenses that all came from a larger sheet that all have similar LPIs, but if I go grab another lens from a different batch, I'll probably get a different number, which won't make for a super successful print. But we now have our number, so it's time for... We'll start by downloading the files from Gumroad, which are linked in the description. Quick side note, I originally made this other design for this tutorial, but it turns out it's kind of like expert level. These will still be available to download, and I'll give some tips on working with them at the end of the tutorial. But as a better starter project, I would suggest this Mustang design. It's much easier to align, and there are only 12 images to work with. So in 3D Master Kit, we can go to Project again and click Add Frames. Just locate the folder that has your files. We're gonna select them all, bring them over, and open. We can now preview the 12 frames and make sure it looks right. You might need to change your canvas size by clicking this button right here. Select 6x4 and click OK. We're now ready to hop over to the lenticular tab. So for the finished picture size, after it's trimmed and completely done, you can choose whatever you want for this, but for this tutorial, I'm gonna make a 4x6, and this should autofill based off of the image size. It'll also tell me what the print size will be, which is slightly larger because 3D Master Kit will be adding alignment markers along the edges, which you'll see when we generate the image. For the resolution, I'm gonna select 720 because of my Epson. I previously used an HP for a lot of my prints, which has a DPI of 600, and that should work great for this setup as well. There's kind of an optimal ratio of DPI, LPI, and number of frames, but with some experimentation and as I've come to learn, it seems like you can kind of make whatever work. So 12 frames isn't actually the best number for an Epson printer, but again, I don't know what I'm doing. And it seems to work okay. And now we need to specify the settings specific to our lenticular lens. We're gonna select vertical because our lens lines are running vertically. And then we'll enter in our pitch test that we got earlier, which for me was 49.72. But again, this is specific to my lens. Your lens will almost definitely have a different number here, and it will kind of make or break how well your lenticular print will work. For the layout, you can change this if you want. I don't think I've really messed with this, but here are my settings if you want to see them. And then I'm going to hit to display. If everything went well, you'll get to see your first interlaced image, which looks like this. And now we're just gonna print it. For printing, again, you want to use the highest quality possible for your printer, but most importantly, we want to use the same settings that we used for our pitch test for this so that we aren't changing any variables. So I'm going to do the same exact thing as before. Obviously, my image will look a little small on the page, so you could use a smaller paper, but there are a few things to consider. One, it's nice to have a bit of room around your print when you're aligning your lens. Two, you will need extra space for the alignment markers and printer margins that you will have to trim later. And three, I've heard it's best to print in this orientation where the print head is running perpendicular to the lenticular lines. So we have the image we can now see on the page, and we're gonna print it. So exciting! Depending on your printer speed, you might want to give this a second to dry, but we can move on to our final step. I'm going to start by wiping off the lens to make sure it is nice and clean. And then we're going to start lining up the lens with the print, with the lines running parallel to those interlaced lines. Need to actually focus for a second. This part can take some time, but what we're trying to do is line up all the sides to see a solid green border along the edge. And here in the middle, there should be this solid black dot right here in the center at both the top and bottom gaps. That's the center point of this rotating animation. You don't have to be as precise as me with this next step, but since I've been making these for videos, I want them to turn out the best they can, and I hate the idea of ruining it at the very end. So with it lined up, I'm gonna tape down 3 of these sides to hold everything in place. I know I'm going overkill on the tape, and I'm leaving the side open. Also just trimming off a little bit of this paper. Everything looks aligned still, so I'm gonna flip it over, and here's where it gets serious. What I like to do, and I've taken these from other people who I've seen making these, is just cut off a sliver of the adhesive backing, where I also know it's not going to go on the picture. It might leave a little cut mark. You can either press this down manually or this is probably overkill, but I'm just going to feed it through the laminator. Again, on cold. Make sure you don't use heat on these lenses. And this is where there's no going back. Once these are attached, you're done. Hopefully not in a bad way. But you can't go back. The lens is now attached at one side, and I can remove all of the tape because it's not going anywhere. With this attached at one side now, we are going to lift this up. One last quick brush. I'm going to grab the adhesive backing and I'm gonna pull it all away, making sure that I hold the print away from the lens the whole time. Really no going back, and we feed it through. Now they're permanently getting attached. This is where we get to see our first real results. And it looks like this one might be a little off. Our first result. So I'm gonna run it through the laminator one more time, just for good measure. And now I am going to use this squeegee to get out some of these tiny bubbles. A lot of these bubbles will disappear after a day or so if you don't do this, but this definitely helps reduce that number by quite a bit. Also, if you do this step, know that the plastic is pretty soft, so you do have to be kind of careful. Okay, so let's quickly trim this down to size. There we go. And completely optional, I'm gonna round the corners. And there you go, one finished lenticular print. This is another one I made with an HP printer and a slightly different process, but it also has 12 frames with pretty similar results. Also, I want to mention that these are fingerprint magnets. I don't know if there's a better solution, but I use rubbing alcohol to sometimes clean these off. I don't know if there's any long-term effects, but it seems to do the trick okay. Now, I mentioned how you can also make one of these, but it's kind of like the super advanced project. It's kind of tricky for two reasons. One, I didn't realize this when I was coming up with this design, but super thin lines and solid colors are kind of hard to work with on lenticular prints. And this is kind of a perfect storm of that. So you tend to get kind of a ghosting effect the more things aren't done correctly. And two, I designed it for an entirely different lens. It's a 40 LPI lens instead of the 50 LPI that we just worked with. It's much thicker and has some really nice properties to it, but the 50 LPI lens has a little bit of room for error. I'm not saying you should go guessing on anything. I spent months trying to figure out this project with the 50 LPI. But with this lens, you really have to get it just right or it will not work. I've only made a handful of successful prints, and even with my process of trying to be really careful, I've messed up a lot because if things get bumped by just a hair, the effect will get warped or just ruined entirely. So if you want to try it, you'll need that lens, which I will link down below. And the process would pretty much be the same, just with using these images, which there's 36 of instead of 12. And I've also only ever made this with an Epson printer. That's my word of warning if you want to attempt this. I really hope you're able to make something just using my workflow as an example. If you do end up making anything, please let me know or tag me on social media. I would love to see your projects. Okay, I think that's it. Bye.